Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Dementia Unplugged. I'm Jeannine Forrest, and we'll be hosting this session on meaningful activities in the home in concert with Dementia Society of America. So glad you're able to join me today. In terms of format, if you are new to Dementia Unplugged, I typically do a bit of a presentation for about 30 minutes and then open it to Q&A, for which you can submit your questions through the chat button. So you can think about questions as we go along, and I look forward to a meaningful dialogue. And as we get started, we typically hear from our president of the Dementia Society of America, Kevin Jamieson, and he will give us a few words of wisdom.
Welcome. Please listen to this important message from the Dementia Society of America. All content, including any potential medical information, is provided as an informational resource only and is not to be used or relied on for any diagnostic or treatment process. It should not be used as a substitute for professional diagnosis, care, and treatment. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any healthcare decisions or for guidance about a specific medical condition. The opinions expressed and the content shared by Dr. Forrest are not necessarily the opinions and content of the Dementia Society of America. Thank you.
I like to start out making sure that all of the listeners have a common nomenclature taxonomy of what we mean by dementia. Think of the word dementia like an umbrella, an overview. Dementia, the word dementia, is not a disease in and of itself, but it indicates a whole variety of potential conditions that can create a dementia, what we call sort of syndrome. And so the ones you may be more familiar with are things like Alzheimer's disease, vascular disease, frontal temporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. All of these come under the umbrella of dementia, and they each have sort of their unique presentations. So that's kind of how I like to start out, that people understand that there are a wide variety of conditions that can cause a dementia kind of presentation. And most dementias, unfortunately, are not curable. And so that's why we spend our time together learning how to care before the cure or the cures are found. Now, with that background in mind, meaningful activities. This is applicable to whatever dementia condition someone is experiencing. And I'd like to start out with a question by asking, what are meaningful activities? What makes that meaningful? And so up on the screen, I have sort of a variety of different sort of interests. It could be gardening, knitting, it could be reading. And the message here is that it's meaningful and unique to the individual. So, for example, if I were to have a dementia and you were thinking of meaningful activities, I would hope that you would really sort of dig deeper and not just think about things that are available or maybe of interest to you or to a larger group, but what is inside me that helps me come alive when I engage in this particular type of activity. So there's no cookie cutter approach. Bottom line, no cookie cutter approach to meaningful activities. There are these nesting dolls that you may be familiar with. And they contain multiple layers of smaller to larger dolls, and on the outside is what you see until you sort of unpeel that onion or take apart that person and see there are many layers. And I love this analogy because it gives us insight into the fact that we're more than what is presented. um, I may be this age, but inside me, I have a long history from childhood onward. And with many dementias, people, the well embedded memories are imprinted and last longer. And so when we're thinking about meaningful activities, we may need to time travel back to a point in childhood, midlife. It may not be the ones that I've picked up in the last 10 years. Okay. I may have started to golf, right, in the last 5, 10 years. But if I develop a dementia, those skill sets and those more recent memories may no longer apply. So we're thinking of sort of a lifetime when we're talking about meaningful activities, and that should always include one's preferences, look at work history, and then add to that one's current abilities. And I'll explain that in more detail as we go along. So the question I get as a dementia educator and family caregiver coach is, my mom, my husband, it doesn't want to do anything, just sits and watches TV all day long, used to be so involved in the community with friends and neighbors and the social circuit, and now doesn't want to do anything. And so on the surface, it looks as if someone, just there may be a depression, and there's often just sort of a, a quandary. What do I do? They don't want to do anything anymore. And so how I try to explain that is the brain is changing um, on a cellular level within the brain. And so it's important not to take this personally, but to understand that the brain is sort of reformatting itself. And the parts of our brain within particularly the frontal lobe, temporal lobes, that are responsible for initiating and sequencing different types of, sort of the next steps of, how you bake a cake or how you thread a needle. Those things are being sort of diminished over time. And so it will present itself as sort of a lack of interest and initiative. Um, People may refuse to engage, but underlying it is because the brain is changing and not allowing that person to automatically, know what to do next or how to engage. Especially in the early stages, there's a fear of making a mistake. Gosh, I really was a great bridge player, and now I don't know how to add points or, sort of figure out what's my next move. Um, and so there is a sense of stigma that can be involved when activities are starting to change, but a lot of it is just for fear of saying the wrong things. People look at how they're judged by verbal and sort of nonverbal cues, and you can pick up when people around you have a sense that something's not quite right. So people may be having difficulty following the rules. Add to that because the brain not only controls cognitive functions, but motor functions, there may be issues with balance or hand-eye coordination that are often required in many activities. So you can see here, I hope, or at least start to understand that the person with dementia, it's not their sort of decision to no longer want to do things that they so have enjoyed for years, but in fact, their brain is not allowing them to do it to the maximum capacity or level of which they were used to. And, this makes it difficult. That said, I want to give sort of a host of different helpful guidelines before we get into specifics. And as you may be aware, the dementia does progress from early to middle to late to final stages. And when we're thinking about activities, it's important to figure out how to adapt an activity, and I'll explain that. But some of the overarching rules or guidelines that I would like to share with you include things like have an activity as part of a daily routine. I encourage families to get a whiteboard and, kind of literally map out, morning, mid-morning, after lunch, dinner, after dinner, sort of general times. And so if people are forgetting what's going to happen next, sometimes having this whiteboard with an activity sort of planned in advance, when possible, is helpful. Make a list, keep a journal of what people enjoy and what's working and what's not. When you engage or initiate an activity, it's important to turn off any background noise, nothing competing, because it takes a lot of effort and concentration to begin with. And if there's a radio or TV in the background, it makes it much more difficult to stay on task, to pay attention. When people have a tendency to say no, if asked, would you like to do something? And often the knee-jerk reaction is no, because it's the known and the comfortable way of pretty much saying, I don't want to put myself at risk, or I really don't understand what you're asking me to do. So it makes sense in one's dementia to say no. Don't let no be sort of the automatic end all be all. I encourage family caregivers or professional caregivers just to say, hey, I could really use your help with, and then you go on to making a salad, right? Or let's try this. This has been so much fun. I am making Christmas ornaments right now, and can you glue this? So you are inviting someone in perhaps the middle of an activity, and they can see your enthusiasm and could, understand that there's, one part that they could play in this. That's why it's important to focus on one step at a time. Uh, in prior podcasts, I've talked about giving options, only two at a time. Meaning, if you say, well, what do you want to do today? That is way too open-ended. And often you'll hear nothing or I don't know. Because again, it draws on a skill set that may no longer be there in one's brain. And so it's much better to say something like, and that's the beauty of having live podcasts. You could say something like, would you like to go, for a walk in the park, or would you like to go to the beach? Okay, two options. better than what do you want to do or what do you want to have for breakfast. Much better to narrow the options to 2, 3 maybe, but that way it still gives dignity and choice. So within that, you're going to focus on one step at a time instead of saying something like, "Okay, well, let's make a meal." Wow, way too wide, way too difficult. I don't even know where to start. I'll give you an example. I have a family member with an Alzheimer's dementia, and she had said, "I will, I want to make chicken stew," and she had been a wonderful cook. And so they got the chicken. Um, waiting for mom to come out of the kitchen with the stew, when in fact it was just the raw chicken in a pot, and it was hours later, and that's as far as she could go. So the idea is be encouraging. It's wonderful that people want to do this, but you'll need to be sort of that part of the brain and companioning your loved one or whoever you're caring for or with, um, to fill in the gaps. Show more, give less directions. What I find is, giving verbal sort of long lists of what to do makes it much more confusing. Show, hand, do things, gesture, actually go along and perform that stirring of the pot, and people can mimic you. Another helpful guideline is come up with things that there's no right or wrong reason or answer, I should say, no right or wrong answer. Um, you'll find that if, trivia is something that people enjoyed, there is often a right and a wrong. And that may become an activity that's no longer possible. So it's asking opinions, tell me about, share your favorite memory about, and then we'll talk about things like the arts. Another piece, what's really important here is to avoid overscheduling. What I find is that in our own compulsion to keep someone, quote, busy, they got someone doing something from the morning, right after breakfast until they go to bed, thinking that that's the best way of spending time with a loved one with dementia, when in fact it's often not. And it over fatigues the brain and can cause frustration, and actually can cause in some cases, can cause a real agitation. And if you don't let the brain rest in between, it just becomes overloaded. So maybe one or two, activities that you've planned, and we'll talk about sort of daily activities and making them meaningful that are embedded. But bottom line, avoid overscheduling. I said this earlier, but I can't tell you how important it is to be encouraging, enthusiastic, and thankful that people have helped or that they're participating, and not in a syrupy way that seems fake or phony. But wow, this is really great. I'm really enjoying it, Mom, that we're spending time reading poetry together. It makes me feel so good. Or I love how your eyes light up when you do X, Y, or Z. Pay attention. Please pay attention. Everyone, all of us, regardless if we have dementia or not, want to be thanked and encouraged. But this is more important because, again, people are fearful of making mistakes and not doing it right. As the dementia progresses, I encourage people to move from what I call sort of a sort of hypercognitive state to more emotional and sensory. So let me give you an an example of that. Um, let's talk about, let's talk about baking bread, right? On a cognitive level, we could, have conversations about, oh my goodness, what was it? What's your favorite breads? What did your mother make when you were growing up? Do you have a recipe? Can you help me write it down? As that becomes more complicated and less able to sort of talk about, we can move into more of the emotional and sensory over time. So my goodness, I can remember, tasting cinnamon buns on a warm or on a frosty winter day. Okay, we're moving towards the emotional. And then we bring in the warm cinnamon buns as we move to the sensory, and we can smell the cinnamon. And we may not even talk about it, but we could just have a whiff of it. And olfactory sense, what you can smell, taste, touch, see, hear, becomes ever so important as we move towards the late and final stages of dementia, because that's not a right or wrong. That is a feeling that we can all tap into. If you're taking notes, mental notes, or written notes, if you're writing right now, I would encourage you to, on your piece of paper, to draw lines so you have 5 columns, because these are sort of the hallmark categories of what I talk about meaningful activities. It's not just one lump sum, and it helps to kind of subdivide, I think, when you're challenged by coming up with ideas. Often the go-to is, leisure activities, but there's more to life in terms of activities, just in terms of just spending leisure time. So those categories are leisure and fun. That's one. Another is self-care. The third is exercise. 4, work / making a difference or feeling valued. So work really imbues those connotations. And then rest and relaxation. So leisure, fun, self-care, exercise, work, making a difference or feeling valued, and rest and relaxation. So if you are a care partner thinking of meaningful activities, now is the time, along with the person with dementia, if possible, or thinking back or interviewing people who have known them for years, to start listing different types of potential activities that fall within these categories. All right, so I'm going to give you some ideas here. Certainly, this is not totally comprehensive, but gives you a beginning sort of boost in terms of creativity. So leisure, fun, the arts. This is one, it's an amazing go-to because it's hard to get it wrong, right? Although I can still remember getting a D in arts in first grade, and yes, yes, I feel like I've been traumatized since that moment. That said, in general, the arts are something that sort of comes from within and can express oneself when words are no longer possible. So watercolors, molding clay, dancing, music. I can't tell you enough, and you probably are familiar if you've been involved in sort of the dementia care world, um, that music is a wonderful connection in terms of having something meaningful. And it has to be a preference to that person. So if I were to have a dementia, I'm sorry for all of you country western fans out there, that would not connect with me. But I can certainly sing, hymns from the church that I grew with, and during my childhood. And I can sing lots of things from the 70s, from Carole King on, right? So it could be singing, developing a choir, humming, playing an instrument, drumming. There's a whole science behind dementia and drumming and how it taps into rhythm. Storytelling, reading poetry. People with dementia can read for a very long time. Now, they may not remember what, the general gist is, 5 minutes, moments later, but it's the actual storytelling, reading, that's the important part. It's the connection. And that's a point I want to emphasize here. It's the connection in terms of the meaningful activity. Sometimes doing things alone just doesn't cut it, but if you're doing it with somebody, that makes it more meaningful. I have a mother-daughter client. The mother has a form of dementia and is in later stages. And the daughter lives out of state. And so we found that reading poetry to each other, and they both have a copy of the poem, and they can read lines and share lines and alternate. And it's such a beautiful dance, and it's a wonderful way of staying connected versus calling mom and saying, oh, well, how was your day today, mom? What did you eat? Who did you talk to? Do you remember XYZ? That can only go on for so long, right? And then what? So the then what is we take it into a more sensory level, or we talk about what was it like growing up in Michigan during the Depression? Tell me, what was the most difficult part for you? Playing cards. Now, people may not get it right? They may not be the stellar poker player they used to, but it is the activity of maybe matching suits, or playing war, or Uno, or matching colors, board games, Wii. So it's not about, again, getting it right or winning. It's about playing and staying involved. Armchair travel. Here's one, client who's traveled the world. And so now what he does is he writes down just lists and lists and lists of places he's been. And we share stories of what it might have been like to, climb Mount Everest. Self-care, a whole other category. Yes, you can look at it, well, it's time to take a shower or brush your teeth or toilet or, eat or dress. Take it to a different level. Self-care, hygiene can be a wonderful, pleasurable activity in and of itself. You can look at eating as just, well, here's something someone has to have food in order to be maintained and make sure they're nourished, or we create this wonderful, pleasurable experience of preparing the menu. And perhaps it may be the person can't make the whole dinner, but here, let's stir the mashed potatoes. Can you do this? Let's work on this together. And then you might have beautiful music. If it's make it a romantic sort of Italian dinner with candlelight. So I hope you're getting a sense of how we move it from the mundane to the sensory. Hygiene. Yes, It could be shower time, and often this can be a real challenging. But if you asked me in my dementia, hey, let's go for a spa, I might be much more inclined to do that. And so it could be a bubble bath with scented candles and pretty music and playing with the bubbles. Dressing, yes, let's put on a fashion show. Let's, see, how you look in this color. But that said, it could be just the fashion show is limited to 2 or 3 outfits. Rest and relaxation. My goodness. This in and of itself can be a wonderful activity. Can be quiet time, the 30 minutes after breakfast and before dinner, in order to give the brain a rest, to prevent what sometimes people call a sundowning. That's a whole other webcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I would encourage you. Deep breathing exercises. So during this 30 minutes or during times of rest and relaxation, it's good for everyone to take 5 deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. One more. Now that was 3. Hopefully you might even feel sort of a decompression in your chest already. Cuddling time, holding hands, being quiet, prayer time, listening to quiet music. This is an activity. An activity doesn't have to be hustling and bustling and doing and achieving and all of that. Rest can be an activity, and relaxation. Build it into your day. Work. Making a difference, feeling valued. I often hear people who've retired say, after I could only play so much tennis or golf, or, I thought that's what I was hoping for, but now what? How do I fill my day? And so that sense of feeling valued, people with dementia have the same need to feel like they're contributing, not being done to all the time. And I see this, unfortunately. Mom's burnt a pot on the stove, so don't let her cook again, right? And so that takes away you know, a whole thing, a whole activity that was so meaningful. It gave her a sense of value to cook for family or to clean, right? For people who are housewives, or having a clean home meant it was a way of showing love, right? And so if you take that away entirely, so how do I spend my day? So some ideas are there opportunities for people to volunteer in different places? Maybe stuffing envelopes. There are a variety here. Teaching a class. I worked with a physician um, in his dementia, and so we would have this physician teach a class about physiology or whatever came to his mind. Now, was it totally correct? No, but it gave him a sense of self-worth, right? Dusting, dishes, it could be just the plastic, the Tupperware, meal prep. Instead of vacuuming, you might want to give her one of those rollers. I had a woman who she was falling because she was picking up all sorts of pieces of paper on the floor. And so literally we found a roller brush and she sort of, quote, vacuumed the entire time. She was safe and happy. Folding clothes, sorting socks. Yes, this can be done over and over again, but have a basket ready. Raking leaves, reading to children, ordering supplies. Worked with a gentleman who was a CEO of a large company, and he would bark out orders. And so I, in his dementia, was his administrative assistant, and I would ask him for, how many bolts he wanted and how many cases of this, and you get the idea here. I worked with a group with people at different stages of dementia where they would fold plastic bags and then braid them in order to create these mats for homeless shelters. And so people in their dementia could do whatever part they could, from sorting the bags to rolling the bags to braiding the bags to writing notes. Sort of this assembly line. Pet care. People can feel of much value if their job is to, brush the cat, if they let, or the dog, or pet the cat, or feed the dog. Pet care. All right, as we're moving, towards the end here, exercise, add that as a real category. This really helps to dissipate any kind of anxiety. It helps with sleep, all sorts of problems that can take place in terms of digestion. So exercise doesn't mean that one has to go out and do marathon work, thank heavens, myself included. But walking whenever possible, build that into the day. Swimming, if you have a pool that's accessible. People can swim until a very late stage. Tai Chi, chair dancing. You can put in a little putting green in your home. Yoga. Look at what's been important and meaningful and what people are capable of. So I hope these 5 categories help to give you an idea of the types of what we call meaningful activities. But there is an onus to be creative here. Hopefully I gave you a little more of insight in how you can diversify your activities. All of that said, each one can be modified and adapted. Think about sailing. The wind's going to happen, and so we have to adjust our sails. So someone may no longer be able to play tennis, right? But I worked with a lady that she would just hold the tennis racket and feel the tennis balls, and we would play tennis matches in the background. And she was a semi-pro player, and the look on her face, and that's the part I want you to pay attention to. You look for the verbal and especially non-verbal expressions that imply an engagement and an enjoyment. If people are slumped over in their chairs and not paying attention, then it is really no longer a preferable activity. So pay attention to see if people are engaged and the timing of it. It doesn't mean it goes on for an hour at a time. Most activities can be 30 minutes or less because with many dementias, their ability to stay attuned and pay attention is diminished. So modify and adapt. I want to end by sharing this sort of quote, and I don't know the author, but I've heard it many times and I love it. I may not remember any of this later, but it means everything to me now. I may not remember any of this later, but it means everything to me now. So this grandfather may not remember that his granddaughter gave him this amazing hug, maybe 10 minutes later. but it meant everything to him now. And that's the important part of this. We're living in the now, we're living in the moment. And that's, I think, what people with dementia teach us, how to appreciate the now, and especially when it comes to meaningful activities. And there is a science when there is a pleasurable activity. There are PET scans that light up and last longer. So if there is an enjoyable, pleasant activity, engagement, we know that people, in terms of mood and behavior, it is a ripple effect, a little lasting effect that can last for a couple hours. The same occurs in the opposite. If there is someone who is not engaging in a pleasurable activity, they can be quite irritable. So it does matter. It does matter that there are important visits and that people can engage in something that's meaningful. So we're learning to care before finding the cures or cure. Now that you know that there are so many different conditions that can cause a dementia, um, it maybe there's one cure. More than likely, there are multiple modalities. So something to think about. If any of you would like help or guidance with coming up with more activities or anything dementia related, you can certainly contact me for a consultation. My private practice is called Through the Forest, and I offer a service called Dementia Coach on Call. So that's dementiacoachoncall.com, or call me at 773-704-1834, and we can walk through different ideas. So give that a thought, or if you know of someone who could use some assistance. I want to thank the Dementia Society of America so much for hosting this program. It's really an honor to be able to share ideas with family caregivers, and as a as a health provider and a family caregiver myself, this helps all of us. Please consider looking at the entire website. It's just chock full of resources, and if possible, consider donating. I am going to stop the recording on the next slide, and then you can start entering your questions.